Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you all. This is our third episode in our podcast on the history and theology and polity of Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalists. And at this point, this part one of this episode is on Transcendentalism, and we're going to be looking at Hedges, Emerson, and Thoreau. So today we're going to go back to our American Unitarian roots as Channing's Unitarian torch passes to Theodore Parker, who we spoke about in our last session, and to the famous writers and philosophers Thoreau and Emerson in the early 1820s. I'll begin with a quote from The Making of American Liberal Theology by Dr. Gary Dorian to better set this historical stage. And Dr. Dorian was a professor of mine, actually, in seminary, and he's one of the leading ethicists in the world at this time. And I promise, here's a caveat, I promise to explain some of the big philosophical bits in everyday language after the quote, although some of you may not need that. In 1833, Frederick Henry Hedge boldly proclaimed that in America, the genuine Kantians and Coleridgians were younger generation liberals. Hedge's sweeping dismissal of his American elders in the Unitarian Christian Examiner, which is a paper at the time, was a provocation to Unitarian establishment that regarded itself as forward-looking and enlightened. His bold proclamation of the superiority of transcendental thinking exhilarated a scattered vanguard of youthful Unitarian pastors and independent intellectuals. Emerson enthused that Hedge was an unfolding man whose article was a living, leaping logos, and hoped Hedge would help him find his way, end quote. There are a lot of big words there, but in the 1820s had a lot of big words flying all around. And this moment is quite key in the formation of American liberal theology that brings us to where we are today. So Kant, long story short, brings us the ideas that the only intrinsically good things are goodwill, and that people should never be a means to an end. The only intrinsically good things are goodwill, and that people should never be a means to an end. He wrote a lot more than that, but that's the part that feeds most closely into this birth of a theological and political movement we know of as Transcendentalism. And Coleridge, Romanticism, in his writing, would echo in Emerson's spiritual romanticism. Up until this moment, Unitarians had an orthodoxy, if you could believe it, today. And there was little about spiritual romanticism in any of the thinking. You'll often find me talking in classes like this or sermons about the development of our non-creedal nature as an outcome of earlier generations of clergy choosing to stop excommunicating one another for difference of belief. The other side of the coin is the writings of the Transcendentalists that won the hearts of a new generation of spiritualists. So I'm going to begin with Hedge, because he was the original reason for the birth of the Transcendentalist Club. That club included Emerson and Thoreau and Louise May Alcott, Margaret Fuller, and others. The Transcendentalist Club, those folks would use it as an excuse to see Hedge when he was visiting Boston. It was originally called Hedges Club before the movement was started. I remember a conversation with a group of colleagues some years ago now about Emerson and Thoreau. And I want to preface this with, I have a confession to make. By default, I'm not a fan of the Transcendentalists at all. Every few years, I pick up the copy of On Walden Pond and try to get through the first few chapters of Thoreau's masterpiece, and find yet again each time that I just can't do it. It is beautifully written, and as a side caveat that's interesting to our science geeks amongst us, some scientists recently, I think it was as recent as like 10 years ago, wound up using his detailed notes about the environment around Walden Pond to be able to assess changes in the environment and the biome over 200 years. So that detailed, pretty neat. For a philosophical, though, and later a political movement that seeks to draw our attention to the immanent and the transcendent, though, it all reads to me as too earnest for my taste. And I suppose it was an earlier age. The first few chapters are a lot about individualism, even though his sisters are doing his laundry and his mom is making him lunches. But yes, he lives unfettered in the woods all alone during the writing of that novel. Sigh. But that's also not totally fair of me. It's true that that's the stuff of his writing that often gets quoted today. So we think of them as fierce individualists. And Emerson would leave clericalism, Unitarian ministry, and ultimately leave the church, though we claim him. And I think we should claim him. I mean, he was clearly a Unitarian minister. And if you do a cursory search of the movement on Wiki, you get this explanation. A core belief of Transcendentalism is in the inherent goodness of people and nature. Adherents believe that society and institutions have corrupted the purity of the individual, and they have faith that people are at their best when truly self-reliant, sandwiches and laundry done by your sisters and mom aside, and independent. Transcendentalism emphasizes subjective intuition over objective empiricism. Basically, adherents believe that individuals are capable of generating completely original insights with little attention and deference to past masters. In many ways, it's the very opposite mindset of where contemporary Unitarian Universalism is going. We are increasingly hearing that we revere the cloud of witnesses, or if you will, at least these days, we have more references to, say, after a memorial service, she's with the ancestors now. I mean, during this period of COVID, we've lost so many people we know, from COVID or not, and so many of our great leaders. And I hear a call after every one of them dies that people say they're with our ancestors now. Even our community church is beginning a significant process of bringing our history more and more into current memory for the people that came before us, that got us here today. We're here because of who came before. So, fierce individualism. But all of that ignores the Transcendentalist lived experience. That's just the writing. And their lived experience is where we can begin to imagine what it would mean to be a people of transcendence, so to speak. The UU minister, Reverend Aaron White, who's currently the associate minister of our large church in Dallas, said, and he said this in the clergy conversation I mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'll quote, that many of the Transcendentalists intentionally committed to disciplines of self-reflection and depth, journaling being one of their core practices. I love, he says, the reading their journals and seeing their beautiful and flawed humanity. They have a true devotion to nature around them and such intimate devotion to one another. They shared explicit gratitude and love with one another in ways that were far more intimate and vulnerable than what was common in their time. We're talking the 1820s on. That's my side note. And he goes on, and far more so than much of our time even. They worked hard to love and be loved amid difference with the larger Unitarian culture and with one another. And their cultivated ability to love and respect one another explicitly shows up so many times, especially in their journals. They're honest in writing about their sexual identities and desires, the blessings of their friendships and moments when they are fractured, and how they wish to live. Both Emerson and Thoreau, in his study and opinion, are deeply influenced by death and grief. He interprets Emerson's departure from the church and Thoreau's visit to Walden as prompted by deep loss in their personal lives. Far from the aloof intellectuals they sometimes get portrayed as, I love seeing their humanity played out on the page, end quote. Despite the fierce individualism the movement gets known for, it was developed and imagined by a group of people in fierce relationship with one another. And despite the common ideas, it springs from a cursory look at the social movement that we can do anything by ourselves. The work of our Transcendentalists, namely Margaret Fuller, centered on lifting up the voice of women in print and the breaking of gender norms in the work world. It was deeply about supporting community to empower our best selves. Individualism, or more accurately, individual worth, fully realized in community. Transcendentalism wanted to move each of us forward. That's the social movement side of their writings. Theologically, they moved us out of strict creed more than anyone. If Coleridge would coin the phrase suspension of disbelief and move the Western world to understanding religion to be about being and not about knowledge, the Transcendentalists would move us away from miracles mattering as proof of the divine and toward a spirituality that encountered the holy in the living world. He declared in 1830 that every man makes his own religion, his own God, his own charity. And I apologize for the gendered language, but that was a quote. Every man makes his own religion, his own God, his own charity. Continuing, the root of religion is firsthand. For the truly religious person, religion is not derived from the Bible or his neighbor. Emerson cautioned that this claim should not be construed as diminishing or undermining religion, for at its best, the notion of God is the elevated conception of character that can be formed in the mind. It's the individual's own soul carried out to perfection. So in our theological history, this is a moment of transition from Channing's earlier preaching on salvation through character, which I talked about last session, to Emerson's idea that our character is a reflection of the divine. Our character is a reflection of the divine. We're not saved through action or external grace, but we slowly grow to realize the holy, divine, immanent, and transcendent, what's here and what's not here, which echoes back to our first session when we were talking about the art in the early church, in the cathedrals, that were looking at a heaven on earth and a reflection of what's here and what's not here, immanent and transcendent. Although I don't believe Emerson ever makes this explicit connection, it would be later echoed by the Jewish theologian Martin Buber in his imagery of the burning bush. To the God conscious, for Buber, every bush is alight with flames. This is where Emerson's intense individualism gives way to the highest purpose. But for him, recognizing the holy comes from within. The Protestant Reformation, taken to its logical conclusion, to protest our way out of the mainstream church. He found his way out of the brick and mortar church. But as my colleague, Reverend Aaron White, pointed out earlier, his group of thinkers and activists kept intentional spiritual practices and intentional deepening of their small group relations. I think on our best days today, we strive to emulate this practice by transforming our congregations in that likeness. Small groups, like maybe it's a choir or a volunteer choir, the small group ministry, Wellspring in our case, many of you take part in monthly. Spiritual practices like meditation groups or yoga groups, the gardeners that grow food for towns across the continent, book groups, and so on. And I do encourage all of us to join one of those, whether it's through us or somewhere else. You never know what may come from that commitment, because going back to Hedges' study, that small group gave the world transcendentalism and so much more. What might yours grow? We're going to pause here now, and I'm going to put some reflection questions in the chat, and I'll say them aloud. So for folks that are, welcome, Lisa. For folks that are here now, one of the things that we're doing is that we're creating this program not just for ourselves and not just to have it on the website, but we're creating a program where other congregations and professionals might tap into it. And so we'll later on be recording this with slides that have these questions so that small groups and other congregations might pull this down and have some discussions with it. So the first question is, or I'll read them all and feel free, what would you like to answer? What about the Transcendentalist jumps out at you or surprises you? Where do you see it alive today in our congregation? This period, like all periods, is very much a story of generational change and the shifting of leadership. Where do you see that occurring in this day and age?